Ending Homelessness in Our Lifetime Conversation to Action event. My name is Tony Dingman. I'm a program coordinator here at the main library, and it really is truly inspiring to me that so many of you have decided to give us some of your time and some of your thought to this particular issue. We've invited the members of today's panel to join us to discuss particularly solutions. And it's my hope that after this conversation, many of us will leave with a renewed sense of purpose and with at least maybe a few more tools in our pocket to help end homelessness with our voices and our actions. But before I introduce the panelists, I'd like to take care of a few technical details. You should note that your video and audio has been turned off by default. That's because there's so many people in attendance today. And we want to focus on one speaker at a time. It's important to me that we feel that we have as much like a conversation as possible, one where we feel like we can offer insights to our guests, but also ask questions. So during this program, if you'd like to ask a question, please type it in the Q&A panel, not the chat. You'll see the Q&A on the tab, either on perhaps the bottom of your screen or depending upon your device, perhaps on the side. And because there's so many of us here today and likely many questions, we'd like to use the upvote function. So when you open up the Q&A and you see questions, there should be a thumb next to it so that you can vote it up. And when you do that, that kind of kicks it up the queue a little bit. So if you have a question that you read someone has entered that you think you would really like answered, just give it a thumbs up. And hopefully we can get sooner to those questions that reflect the general sense of what the audience wants to know. If we find time for some verbal feedback, I can promote you to a panelist to have you speak if we have time for that. There's a lot of us here and a lot to cover. But if we do, and if we ask for someone, there's a little hand raise feature. You're welcome to use that as well. We won't get to everyone, I'm pretty sure. It's a pretty large group of people here, but do raise your hand if we ask for it. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, our moderator today is Dr. Susan Buchino. She holds a joint appointment as Director of Homeless Services Division of Louisville Metro Government and as an assistant professor in the Department of Health, Promotion, and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Louisville. Dr. Buchino's current work is influenced by her experiences as an occupational therapist, providing community-based services to adults with cognitive disabilities, the majority of whom relied on public benefits and the supports of social services to maintain housing. After witnessing her clients encounter innumerable systemic barriers that made achieving health a cumbersome task, Dr. Buchino has dedicated her research and advocacy to creating changes in her hometown of Louisville. They provide her a foundation of every resident's quality of life. On the panel is Celine Mutuyemaria. She's a community policy strategist at the Louisville Urban League, and she's focused primarily on housing and health policy. She believes in using a collaborative and systems level approach to changing social, economic, and health outcomes for Black people and other marginalized communities. Rather than focus solely or primarily on behaviors of individuals, Celine believes that it's more logical, effective, and equitable to look at public policy in order to advocate for more investment in community needs. In part, this belief comes from a quote Celine first heard from a local researcher, Asia Barber, and which Celine uses to ground her work. And the quote is, "The choices people make are based on the choices people have." Councilman Jacory Arthur is an award-winning teacher, musician, and activist from the West End of Louisville, Kentucky. He's taught around the world, performed in dozens of symphony orchestras, provided workshops, lectures, and content educating people about the state of Black Kentucky and Black America. He is currently a professor at the HBCU Simmons College of Kentucky. In 2020, he was elected the youngest member of Louisville Metro Council in city history. Tony Curtis is the interim executive director for the Metropolitan Housing Coalition. In December 2021, Tony became the interim executive director of the Metropolitan Housing Coalition, following almost 4 years as MHC's Director of Development and Communications. Prior to joining MHC in April 2018, he worked for 11 years at the Kentucky Historical Society in Frankfort, Kentucky, as a public historian and documentary editor. He holds a Bachelor of Arts in History, minor in Government, and a Master's in Arts from Marshall University. Giselle Danger-Mercaderes is coordinator of homeless education at Jefferson County Public Schools. She holds a master's degree of social work from the University of Louisville. Her main role in the district is to ensure the homeless students are identified by schools, personnel, and other agencies, ensure that homeless students enroll in schools and have a full and equal opportunity to succeed in school, ensure that homeless students receive educational services for which they're eligible, ensure that homeless students and their guardians are informed of education rights, and ensure that the district is compliant with the McKinney-Vento law. Most importantly, ensure that homeless students have access to school stability and continuity. So without further ado, I would like to introduce these, if you would, co-hosts, if you would come on up, and we will begin. I think we should begin perhaps with a poll, and I'm going to put that poll up there, and if you would, please answer. The answers are anonymous. You're welcome to put your answers in there, and I'll turn it over to Susan.
All right, well, thank you, Tony, for hosting this, and for all of you for attending today on a Sunday afternoon and spending your time with us. Kind of watching the poll here. But while you're answering that, I wanted to spend a couple minutes just telling you a little bit more about homelessness in Louisville. On a given night, Louisville is home to at least 1,000 people experiencing houselessness. Due to changes in how we have counted, whether people would come in or eviction court, street count, and shelter provision, we have struggled to really understand the numbers of people losing housing in our city. But as we close out a second year with COVID, we are starting to believe that the number of people who have been served by homeless services in the city are actually increasing, in addition to avoiding congregate settings. In 2020, over 9,700 people were recognized as requesting services for houselessness at some point throughout the year. A year ago, in the last week of January, outreach teams conducted our annual point-in-time count. In addition to the people that fill the city's overnight shelters, which were all at capacity, 257 individuals were identified as sleeping out that week. We estimate that this number will be higher this year. Recently, it's been estimated that as many as 35% of individuals experiencing houselessness report that they stay unsheltered, in camps, on the streets, in their cars, or in other places not meant for habitation. With that, the need for emergency shelters is inevitable. But currently, Louisville can only meet 67% of the shelter needs of individuals and 54% of the needs of families. This drastic shortage is a problem, but it's not the only reason that our houseless population stays on the streets. People choose to sleep out for a variety of reasons: restrictions on staying with a partner or pet, or keeping more than a few of their belongings, difficulty following the rules of the shelter, or having been previously barred, fear of being found, whether that is because of an outstanding warrant or an abusive relationship, feelings that shelter staff are disrespectful or unhelpful, or just that a congregate setting with 100 bunk beds is more overwhelming than it is bearable. It is important to recognize that houselessness is often precipitated by trauma, and houselessness itself is traumatic. The only solution to houselessness is permanent housing. Housing instability and houselessness are intimately linked, and people most often become houseless both initially and repeatedly because of poverty, the prohibitive cost of housing that is available to them, and systemic discrimination. In fact, individuals experiencing houselessness are often employed full-time in low-wage jobs. About half of Louisville's houseless population reports that their last residence was in one of the 10 poorest zip codes in Jefferson County. And for our segregated city, this means that houselessness disproportionately impacts African Americans. The other half of the population comes from nearly every other zip code in Jefferson County. And yet our community simply does not have enough affordable housing nor enough emergency shelter beds to house every Louisville resident. The housing needs assessment conducted in 2019 states that Louisville has a severe shortage of housing units that are affordable to our poorest households, particularly those earning $36,000 or less, which is 50% of the area median income. Specifically, Louisville needs an additional 31,000 housing units for those earning $25,000 or less, which is 30% of the area median income. Again, this is throughout the county. The East Core, which includes St. Matthews, Cherokee Gardens, and Indian Hills, or what we might recognize as some of the wealthiest neighborhoods, needs 2,600 more affordable housing units to meet the needs of its residents who earn less than $36,000 for their 4-person families. And so what does Louisville do to address the needs of individuals experiencing houselessness? Louisville's Continuum of Care, or the services funded by the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, receives approximately $10 million annually for 36 projects managed by 12 agencies throughout the community. And that includes permanent supportive housing, transitional housing, and rapid rehousing. Emergency shelters and houseless prevention services are funded through Louisville Metro's budget, some of which is also HUD money. The Continuum of Care has embraced the Housing First model, and this model posits that people are more likely to succeed in achieving health and financial goals while in stable housing. And so it is our aim to move people from their housing crisis back into housing as quickly as possible. And so it's not enough to offer only emergency shelter. You might know about soup kitchens, and Louisville has over a dozen organizations that offer meals throughout the week. But beyond that, Louisville Metro's Homeless Service Initiative funds several additional services that aim to reduce barriers to getting back into housing, including dedicated outreach teams employed by St. John Center and Uniting Partners for Women and Children, 7 County Services, Bridgehaven, and the Healing Place. The critical role of these teams is to build relationships that move people toward receiving the assistance they need, and it works. By recognizing the humanity and the resilience of people experiencing houselessness, these teams have ensured that more people are accessing shelter and critical services to remove the barriers to permanent housing. We also fund a storage site at the Salvation Army, at which individuals can lock their belongings safely rather than carrying them around town. An assertive community treatment team through Wellspring, which provides wraparound services for individuals with chronic and persistent mental illness, and legal consultation through Legal Aid. And those are just a few. The American Rescue Plan has offered us an opportunity to create some additional options, and $89 million has been appropriated to building new affordable housing developments, building permanent supportive housing developments, establishing a safe outdoor space, and promoting home ownership and providing assistance with home repairs. So we're working to end houselessness through programs and upcoming housing developments, but we know that that's not enough either. So I want to begin with a question for our panelists to expand on that. What is being done currently in Louisville? And so, Celine, if it's okay, I'll start with you.
Thank you, Dr. Buchino. Hi, everyone. My name is Celine Mutuyemaria, and I am a community policy strategist at the Louisville Urban League. The Louisville Urban League is an affiliate of the National Urban League Network, and our mission is to assist African Americans and other marginalized populations with access to social and economic equality through direct services and advocacy. And the direct services part of our work is really focused on programs that are centered around our 5 pillars. And those pillars include jobs, justice, education, health, and housing. So in our housing department, we are actually the oldest HUD certified counseling agency in the state of Kentucky. And we offer programs and support and resources that provide pathways to Black home ownership. And that is critically important because we recognize that home ownership provides a sense of housing stability and housing security that unfortunately the rental market does not. And so historically, we have offered programs and services that provide people with the education and resources and information to make home ownership a reality. Now, in the space for folks who are not really at the place where home ownership is considered something that is attainable to them at the time that they seek services, we also look at what programs and services we can offer that will allow for housing security and stability for our renters as well. And that is a much more difficult process, just because, again, there aren't just the inherent securities that home ownership offers in the rental market. So we do things like working with landlords and trying to provide mediation services as much as we can to maybe prevent an eviction from happening. We have a jobs department that can help folks get connected to new job opportunities and higher wages that might offer that sense of stability that they need. We also have recently supported folks with applying for rent assistance. The city has millions of dollars in rent assistance from the federal government as a result of many policies that were passed because of COVID-19. And unfortunately, oftentimes from the point that a tenant applies for rent assistance, it can take up to 12 weeks for the city to get a check into the hands of a landlord. And so we do a lot of advocacy, whether it's directly with landlords and tenants, or even in the eviction court space, where we're trying to make judges understand the circumstances and the environment that renters are facing right now, and looking at whatever strategies that we can help to support and implement that will offer an opportunity for people to access these critical resources at the time. So that is a lot of the work that the Urban League is focused on right now when it comes to our direct services and advocacy work. And I will make space for the other panelists to share their thoughts as well.
Giselle, do you want to share a little bit about what your work looks like?
Of course, thank you. I want to start by saying that I really appreciate your introduction. I think that it really provided a good summary of what homelessness looks like in Louisville, but also the causes, because a lot of people focus a lot on what are the things that they are seeing in the street mainly, but they don't realize like the systematic things that are happening in the city that actually make it possible for homelessness to continue to grow in our city. So I really appreciate your introduction and your deep thoughts when it comes to look at homelessness in the big picture. So my name is Giselle Danger. I work with Jefferson County Public Schools, and my role centers around supporting families or students that are homeless. Now, with homelessness, many of you probably know that the definition of homeless depends on what system are you working with. For example, when I work with some of our families and I had to work in collaboration with the Housing Authority, they have a very, I would say, restrictive view of what they see as homeless. Basically, you have to be in the street, you have to be sleeping in a car, in an uninhabitable place, maybe living in a shelter. For us in a school district, we have the opportunity of serving families that are also without a house. They don't have a house of their own, but we have more flexibility. For example, we recognize as being homeless families that live together due to lack of housing. So that might look like somebody is allowing a family to stay in their house, but that's not really their house. We also have families that have to share a basement. We have families that, due to many different reasons, they are unable to keep their house, but they are not living necessarily in the street or in a shelter. So what I'm saying with this is that it's important to recognize that there are many, many reasons why people find themselves homeless, but there are many circumstances that will make somebody homeless. And I think that one of the reasons why sometimes we don't see a good number that really represent the issue and the scope of the problem in our city is that we lack the understanding, or we lack of one definition that is more realistic. In JCPS, for example, we identify between 5,000 and 6,000 homeless students every year. And that is a number that, in my opinion, is still an underestimation, because many of you probably know that it's really difficult to come out and say, especially in a school environment, that your family is experiencing homelessness. So a lot of the work that we do is, sharing with families why it's important to share their housing situation. There are specific resources available and protections under federal law, but families still many times, because of stigma, because of they don't understand what they might be getting themselves into, that they sometimes don't reach out to, you know, our services. So that's why I'm so excited to see so many people here, because my goal really is to connect with other agencies so we can do a better job in connecting families. So some of the things that we do in JCPS, I want to be honest. So the first question that when people call our office in JCPS and they know that we help families that are experiencing homelessness, they ask about housing, but that is not our main, the main resource that we provide. What we do is we provide educational stability and continuity for students while they're facing homelessness. So we will make sure that no matter how many times they have to move from place to place, and that is something that really affects students academically, that they can stay in one school with transportation and with all the resources they will need to be successful. So my office many times work with families. Many times they move from hotel to hotel, from a hotel to somebody else's house, from somebody else's house to a shelter. They transition a lot. But during that process, once we identify them, we will make sure that they can stay in one school. We provide tutoring services, welfare assistance. We make sure that if they need additional academic support, we will provide that. We serve as an advocate for the student and the family, because we do understand that homelessness alone is a traumatic experience, and students will display sometimes behaviors and sometimes things that can be difficult to navigate if you don't have an advocate. So that is a little summary of what JCPS does. I will say that in the last years, we have added, in addition to specialized buses for our homeless students, we have added special routes and vans and many, and specific teachers that can support homeless students. We have a department that have a few social workers that support specifically families that are homeless. My goal is to see the department expanding because the need is there.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Giselle. Councilman Arthur, what are you seeing that's currently being done in Louisville?
Peace. Before I answer that question, I'd like to just speak in terms of like the legal language around really understanding our local metro government definition of who is homeless. And then I'll speak to those numbers and show a chart in a minute to contextualize what we're talking about when we discuss the unmet need of housing. And then I'll speak on some of the initiatives here. And then before we go, talk about what's coming up that you can help advocate for. So, based on our code of ordinances, the definition of being homeless or a homeless individual person is an individual who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence, and an individual who has a primary nighttime residence that is a supervised publicly or privately operated homeless shelter designed to provide temporary living accommodations, including welfare hotels, congregate shelters, and transitional housing for the mentally ill, or two, an institution that provides a temporary residence for individuals intended to be institutionalized, or three, a public or private place not designed for or ordinarily used as a regular sleeping accommodation for human beings. That is the textbook's definition for us at Louisville Metro Government. Now, to think about how severe this issue is, I want to just share the 2019 Housing Needs Assessment, which you've heard reference, but I just want to look at the numbers to really understand how deep this crisis goes. And I hate this chart because it's not clear with the colorways and some of the icons what we're looking at here, but I want you to look at the bottom of the chart, that 31,412 number of unmet needs for families at the lowest level of income. Those are the families that are usually going to slip into becoming unhoused. And another important number to keep in mind on the left here, this blurb mentions to close that affordability gap, to build all of this new housing, we're talking $3.5 billion. That was in 2019. According to Louisville Forward, our community and economic development department within Louisville Metro government, that number has risen to about $5 billion. So when we talk about the housing gap and we talk about what we're doing and what we have done and what we can do, we have to understand the math. Because if this is a $5 billion job and Louisville Metro government's budget is barely $5 billion, and when I say the budget, I mean the entire city budget, we're talking about a multi-generational problem that requires a multi-generational solution. So I know the title of this event is Ending Homelessness in Our Lifetime, but based on where we are, if our federal government, our state government, and our local government continue investing in housing the way that we have been historically, I will die. Everyone on this call will die before we ever see the end of homelessness. And I wanted to give you that reality check as we have this conversation. So in terms of what we've been doing, and keep in mind that $5 billion number, we, Louisville Metro government, along with so much community support, shout out to the Coalition for the Homeless and every single person who advocated for funding, we have been able to dedicate over $100 million specifically for building new housing. But beyond that, new housing for families that need it the most. And I just showed you that chart, families at the lowest level of income. For the first time since the Affordable Housing Trust Fund has been created, we are paying attention to that 30% area median income household and making sure they are prioritized when we allocate these dollars. On top of that, since we are Louisville Metro Council and we pass budgets, but we also pass laws, we have amended our homeless encampment ordinance that was introduced by Councilman Bill Hollander years ago to modernize it and make sure there is a risk assessment to base relocations off of, as opposed to some of the more unjust ways that camps have been cleared or relocated in the past. It has to be based on health risk. We've also added homelessness or homeless status to our local hate crime code of ordinances. So now we are trying to make sure that we're preventing crimes, we're preventing attacks, we're preventing violence done to our unhoused Louisvillians. And that has been so important for us to do. So we're doing so much work in terms of funding and in terms of meeting people where they are and protecting them. But in the context of the larger crisis, if we only continue to allocate $10 million to the Affordable Housing Trust Fund, and we took all of that money specifically for families at the lowest level of income, at this rate, assuming that nobody moved to our city, nobody had babies, nothing happened to our population, it would take over 1,600 years to close that housing gap that I just showed you on that chart. So while we've done so much work, we have a lot more work to do, and it's going to require not only local government, but local partners such as yourself, state government, and also the federal government to make sure that we're addressing houselessness here and beyond.
Thank you, Councilman Arthur. And Tony, what can you add to that as far as what we're doing as a city?
I would say a lot has been covered in my previous panelist discussion here, but I'm the interim executive director of the Metropolitan Housing Coalition, and we engage in data-driven advocacy and education on fair and affordable housing in Louisville. A lot of it is by providing a good baseline of data on affordable and fair housing issues in Louisville. We've been doing that for 19 years in our State of Metropolitan Housing Report. And a lot of that data is used by organizations at Louisville Metro government, nonprofits, and other organizations across the city in order to help build the case for more affordable housing. Because at the end, it is access to, it is a housing choice, it is housing opportunity across the entire city that we need to be focused on. And so MHC does a lot of advocacy and education work on these issues, a lot of policy work, because you have to create the policy environment in order to be able to expand where affordable housing can be built. And one of those, we have a lot of issues we're working on, and I'm sure we'll get to a lot of those here throughout the discussion, but one of the big ones for MHC right now is land development code reform. Because you have to be able to expand and redefine what the built environment is in Louisville and what is allowed to be built in different areas of town in order to be able to close this housing gap. And we're really looking at, phase one has already happened as far as recommendations. Phase two, we are starting to work on right now. And MHC is really looking at those recommendations through a lens of really three goals, which is decrease residential segregation and increase housing choice by allowing affordable housing to be constructed in all parts of the city. We're also looking to increase the production of affordable housing and increase production of diverse housing types like multiplexes and duplexes and pocket neighborhoods. And we need to create this diverse housing to meet an ever-growing and diverse population in Louisville. So land development code reform is a huge issue that everybody should be focused on if we really want to meet these affordable housing needs that Councilman Arthur was talking about. 31,412 at 30% AMI and below. And like he was saying, the need has more has grown and grown as far as the financial contribution. And no matter what the Affordable Housing Trust Fund is able to do at $10 million and match dollars they invest with other dollars invested in affordable housing, even if it's $17 for every dollar they have, we still have a huge gap that we need to address over the long term, over the short term. And there are a lot of other issues. We're really building coalitions around a lot of these issues, having discussions with partners at the city, with other nonprofits across town. And another, I think, huge conversation that we're having, the housing crisis did not just happen at the pandemic. There was not an eviction crisis that just popped up. There's always been an eviction crisis in Louisville, and paying attention to other issues related to housing, such as utilities. So I look forward to discussing a lot of those issues today and look forward to hearing some questions from everybody attending.
Thanks, Tony. All right, so I want to go and throw some questions your all's way that are a little specific to what you do. And so, Giselle, I'm going to come back to you for this one first. So you talked about how there's a difference in count and maybe that you're seeing specifically around families and children versus what we might report as a city, and how JCPS identifies houseless families that need assistance. What gaps are you seeing in support that are specific to children and families as you're serving them and trying to connect them with services and increase their stability while they're trying to learn?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Well, we have engaged in a process of really looking at our data critically. And one of the things that we saw was that we were able to identify better our students that were experiencing housing instability and homelessness in early years, meaning early childhood and elementary. We also saw that it was more difficult to identify students that were homeless or families that were homeless when they have students in middle high school. And really, it was our understanding based on the data we collected, surveys that we did, multiple conversations with families, is that there is, it was difficult for families to share their housing situation, especially for older students. So we created networks within the school. Every single school now in JCPS has a school homeless liaison that their main goal is not a position that the only thing that they do is that. Many times it's a counselor, could be an assistant principal, but that person really look at the culture and climate of the school to make sure that when they encounter families that might need assistance, that they make that process more seamless and they allow us to provide support faster. That has been very, very helpful. The other thing that we were seeing was that there is a huge disconnect in between services needed and available resources and our ability to connect with families, especially with the immigrant refugee community. We, based on our data, we saw that we had a lot of students that would qualify for free and reduced lunch that were also immigrant and refugee, but we were not seeing them asking for housing assistance or McKinney-Vento services. So once we invested, we realized that we also realized that the forms that we were collecting and the way that we were attempting to have conversation with families was not necessarily the best way, culturally sensitive way to deal with our families. So we have changed the way that we're doing things. We have hired, staff that can connect better with the families. We have translated our services, and we still have a long way to go. But since I am in this, panel, I think that it's important to also realize that the homeless population in our city is very diverse. And it is important to look at race and discrimination and how that plays a factor within our system. We know in our district that our homeless students are more likely to be Black and brown students than any other student population. And we also see that when we identify students that are Black or brown students in our school district that are homeless, they stay homeless the longest. And what we're trying to make sure is that they receive services immediately, because we know that their gaps are already larger. So that is some of the gaps that I'm seeing. Other things that I see right now is that there is not enough funding. And I know that we have talked about that, but really it's important that we put the resources if we really are committed to changing the way that we serve our families. For example, I give you an idea. We serve between 5,000 and 6,000 homeless students in JCPS every year. And only in the few recent years, because of the advocacy of Dr. Polio, we now have social workers in our department, but we only have less than 3 social workers. So imagine 3 full-time social workers working for 5,000 to 6,000 homeless families. I would like to be able to provide more support, but I think it's going to take a more of a commitment for the entire city, the state, to be able to address some of the gaps and some of the resources that it will take to resolve the homeless situation in our city.
Thank you. So, Celine, this next question is for you, because we've already touched a little bit both on what we're doing currently in terms of programs and services, but then also on the policy level and systemic change. And can you just talk to us a little bit about the differences between direct support work, systemic change work, and then how they're both necessary to address this issue?
Yes, I'd love to. And so the way that I like to talk about this and think about this is, if someone comes to the doors of the Louisville Urban League and maybe they've lost their job because their company was shut down due to COVID-19 and they're about to be evicted. So direct service work looks like maybe we get them connected to rental assistance, maybe we get them referred to our jobs department to help them find a steady source of income so that they can maintain their housing. Or maybe somebody comes to us and they are in the financial situation and they are just in the position where they can consider home ownership. And so we can talk to them about what that experience looks like, what it means to become a homeowner, how you can become a homeowner. That's what that direct service work can look like. So sometimes it's crisis prevention. Maybe that person is already has already been evicted and they need new housing before they have no other choice but to go to the shelters. So we do that type of work every day. And we're very proud of that work because people need that type of crisis level support right now. They need help to stop the bleeding and be able to get to a place where they can work towards other goals. And that's very important. However, what we have to also recognize is that these problems are not problems that are solely caused by personal decision making. People can be working 40 hours a week and still not be able to afford housing in the rental market. People can be in a position where they have saved up and they've worked really hard and they have the opportunity to become homeowners, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to become homeowners because of barriers related to banks and their lending practices, and also just discrimination related to housing policies in general. In fact, the reason why we see such low rates of Black home ownership in Louisville, according to the 2019 American Community Survey data, the rate of Black home ownership in Louisville was 37.2%, whereas the rate of home ownership overall was 67.1%. Those numbers are not because of individual decision making. Those numbers are because in the 1930s, our federal, state, and local governments, along with our banking institutions, colluded to enact policies and practices that made sure that Black people were locked out of opportunities for home ownership. So the numbers that we see today are related directly back to policies and practices that were enacted by people in power, right? And data also shows that if we're talking about renters, minimum wage has been $7.25 since I was in high school. And that was over a decade ago. And what research shows right now is that in order to afford a 2-bedroom house in Louisville, you have to be making no less than $15.78 an hour. And then when you look at the fair market rent for a 2-bedroom, studies show right now that that's about $821. You would have to be working 70 hours a week at our current minimum wage to afford a 1-bedroom rental and 87 hours a week to afford a 2-bedroom rental. So, okay, sure, maybe our programs can teach people how to budget, right? Maybe our programs can offer some temporary relief for those types of situations. But at the end of the day, it's policies that have gotten us into this predicament where we are seeing homelessness and we are seeing such difficulties helping people to secure housing and have stable housing. And so that is why we need change at the systemic level as well. And we really need to be looking at policies. We need to be evaluating how our elected officials are prioritizing housing security and stability. Do our federal, state, and local budgets reflect an investment in housing and an investment in the people in our communities? And so that is why at the end of the day, we're never going to be able to get rid of the need for direct services, but what's really going to be able to make a transformative impact on more than just one individual are those policy changes and those systemic changes. And so that is why the Urban League in 2021 was able to have additional resources to create a policy team so that we're looking at these issues kind of in that multifaceted way.
Thanks, Celine. So I think, Celine, we're talking about the differences between charity and people needing direct services and justice, right? And those policies that we need to create systemic change so that we can reduce what people need and just make sure that people have what they need. So that means I'm going to go back then to Tony and ask you a little bit more about eviction prevention so we can move in ways that people aren't experiencing houselessness to begin with. And so you talked a little bit already about utility needs, and we've talked about direct services to prevent houselessness, but Louisville has an eviction rate. Before COVID, Louisville had an eviction rate that's twice that of the national average. What policy and practice issues should we be doing? Like, what should we be doing to address and aid people to maintain their housing and prevent that to begin with?
Thank you for that question. I'm going to say my internet connection is a little unstable, so I may have to turn my video off here in a minute just to save some bandwidth. But that is a very large question too. As you can imagine, that as I said earlier, that and as you just reinforced, the eviction crisis did not just pop up during the pandemic. There has been an eviction crisis for a long time in Louisville and across the country. And so there have been rental assistance programs, there have been utility assistance programs. There's a lot of discussions around kind of the long-term sustainability of those programs that have been created and continue to create change in more tenant-centered programs, really. So we need to continue to work on that need to be, I guess, refunded and reenacted as well. So thinking about a tenant south to actually enact one in April 2021 for families with children whose income is below 125% of poverty. That was a huge victory and a huge pilot project. But we need to expand that funding. We need to expand that coverage to individuals, all individuals in that bracket, and even look at any individual who is in eviction court, because they deserve representation just like anybody in the criminal system does. So there needs to be a lot of work and reform on that, but it helps to balance the power dynamic and address issues of landlord harassment, discrimination, and whatnot. Another thing that is important is strengthening the rental registry in Louisville. We had one created, but we need to really maintain, we need to enforce it in a robust way. And it's an important tool to ensure compliance by landlords on housing codes, on unlawful evictions. And I would even go further to say that this is really a question about transparency and accountability. That's where that discussion needs to be centered moving forward. Talking about things like eviction expungement or sealing of court records, that's currently before the state legislature, House Bill 159 right now. It provides for the sealing of court records so that it can help mitigate harmful long-term harm and consequences for evictions, and provide safe housing and many landlords will not rent to people who have had an eviction they filed against them, let alone an actual judgment in eviction court. And there are serious impacts on households who experience a forced move out. Many families move to poorer or higher crime neighborhoods. So we're talking about public safety issues. So housing is a public safety issue. It's harmful to children and family well-being and stability to children who, and their education efforts, and increased mental and physical health harms as well. And this doesn't even bring into the picture and mention the loss of property, important documents, family photos, loss of identity as well. And we really need to look at this. How do you reestablish yourself once you have faced an eviction? And there is House Bill 160 right now, and it talks about landlord responsibilities about tenant properties and what that responsibility is. And this does not prevent evictions, but it goes a long way in helping individuals to reclaim their lives, find stable and safe housing again. And it does not allow the previous landlord to maintain ownership and provide barriers to their lives moving forward. And that's the basis of this conversation. We also need to look at eviction court reform. That's a large discussion that needs to happen. Reducing barriers to access to funding for housing for tenants, especially. Looking at the Uniform Residential Landlord Act, right? It's stuck in the 1970s and it's very imbalanced towards landlords. And there's currently House Bill 152 before the state legislature that tries to, I wouldn't say bring us up to 2022, but at least brings us up to maybe 2000 and makes a step forward and really reworking that. And it needs to be applied statewide, not just as an opt-in, all or nothing kind of a bill for the state. So we need to have equitable tenant access to laws such as that. And I would even say, think about what do evictions look like outside of court? So what does a mediation model look like instead of having to go before a court of justice for tenants? And back to the land development code reform, right? It's just, we have to create that policy framework in which to expand affordable housing because it's a supply issue, it's a choice issue, it's an opportunity issue, and how do we make that happen? And then I would point to just kind of individuals to remember kind of these stats. Renters are approximately 38% of Louisville Jefferson County's population. There is a huge disparity in the impact of evictions by race. 63% of Louisville's Black households and 62% of Louisville's Hispanic households rent, while 29% of Louisville's white households rent. There is also a disparity in the impact of eviction on female-headed households. who rent, and they rent at a rate of 57% in Louisville, Jefferson County. So we cannot forget kind of those basic facts that there is a disparity in the impact on evictions in Louisville. And it's a monumental task, but there needs to be a lot of reform. There are some policy reforms that are reactionary, but we need to be more proactive in our approach to actually solve this issue.
Thanks, Tony. That's a lot. And I think I'm going to add in that list of policies that we need. We also need some enforcement, because we have policies that don't necessarily aren't consistently enacted and then not enforced. So, Councilman Arthur, with all of these things that have been named, what is the city's responsibility to its residents around these issues?
In my opinion, I believe that government should always be a safety net for the citizens in the city, the state, and the country. And oftentimes you have a different ideology where people think that individuals are responsible for themselves. There should be no assistance, there should be no safety net. But I'm of the opinion, not only is that the proper thing to do politically, but also morally. I also believe that if government broke it, government should fix it, as you heard Celine reference earlier. And this housing crisis was perpetuated and created by our government at all levels. So we, without a doubt, need to address it. And I'll also turn that question around and say, as much responsibility as we have as government, as elected officials and otherwise within government, please never forget the power that you have as a citizen, as a voter, maybe as someone who doesn't vote, or anyone in between. Please never forget the power of your advocacy. I often say that anyone who believes that only a politician can practice politics was taught all wrong, because it's not only the mathematician that does math. It's not only the musician who makes music. You need to practice politics. And I know that I get paid for it, but your dentist gets paid to clean your teeth. And I hope that you brush your teeth every day. Politics is an art form that everyone should be practicing. Everyone's on an MLK kick. You know what MLK said to do if you really want political change, if you want social change, if you were serious, he said you should be doing three things. You should be reading, you should be discussing, and you should be practicing. So hopefully you've read some materials coming into this conversation today. We're discussing right now, but when this is all said and done, I hope that you are also practicing. Because let me tell you a secret that I've learned since I've been on Louisville Metro Council. The more people you have, the more power you have. I was literally elected because a majority of people voted for me and put me in office. Every policy that we have passed, from the homeless hate crime ordinance, to amending the encampments, to the ARP funding, the American Rescue Plan funding, it was because a majority of the people on the council decided that is what they wanted. And beyond that, a majority of the people who engaged in the process told us that's what they wanted. I'm gonna throw another chart up, and if you can't tell, I like charts. We had thousands of people in this city engage Louisville Metro government, the mayor's office, as well as Metro Council about the American Rescue Plan. This is just the Metro Council results. The Metro Council results overwhelmingly show you that a top priority for the people who responded to our survey was what? Affordable government supported housing. So when Councilman Bill Hollander, chairman of the budget committee, when the council decided what our American Rescue Plan priorities were going to be, guess what was at the very top of the list? Exactly what you see reflected here based on what community members told us was the priority. And then when we allocate the dollars, guess what is allocated the most funding? Now, let me tell you something else, because we got to dive into the context of the more people you have, the more power you have. We're talking a couple thousand people. who contributed to this conversation and helped us prioritize housing. We're talking about the Coalition for the Homeless and everyone that they mobilized and organized to engage council in the mayor's office. A couple thousand people in a city of what, almost 800,000 people. So I'm proud of this couple hundred people that contributed to that conversation. But where are your cousins? Where are your uncles and your aunts? Where's your mama? Where's your daddy? Where's your best friend? Where's your neighbor when it comes to practicing politics? And contacting your Metro Council person is practicing politics. Responding to the American Rescue Plan survey is practicing politics. Sharing that survey and encouraging other people to engage in it is practicing politics, because we can sit here and we can talk about policy all day long. But if you do not have advocacy, you will not pass policy. So I implore everyone in this conversation, don't just listen to us talk. Don't just read about houselessness. When you leave this space today, pick up something that you've learned and use it in context, whether that is engaging your mayor or engaging your council person, engaging your state representative or senator or otherwise. Please practice and engage in the solutions that we are discussing. Otherwise, you just wasted your Sunday afternoon.
Thank you, Councilman Arthur. That chart was great because not only was the majority line, that biggest line was pointing toward affordable housing, there was another great line that had pointed to eviction prevention. But then, as Celine pointed out earlier, housing is public safety. Housing is public health. Housing is economic development. Housing is early childhood care. And so all of those things are so connected. And so despite their broken down into multiple lines, if we can make sure that people are housed and stable, we can address those other needs really well. And that's my public health background coming out. So before we open it up to questions that we've been receiving in the Q&A box, what I want to do then is expand a little bit on what you just started, because this is talking now about a culture change that has to occur that addresses houselessness. And how do we keep shifting this conversation to address root causes and that are systemic and structural and not always really around individual behaviors and responsibilities and choices? So any of the panelists, how do we keep shifting this conversation?
I'd love to jump onto that question. And the way that I often think about this, and for this question, I'd like to speak just as Celine, right? Not a representative of the Urban League necessarily, because I think about these issues all the time. I daydream about them, I night dream about them, all of it, right? So when I think about what it would take for a cultural change around this conversation, first I have to look at, well, what is the dominant narrative that exists right now? In our culture right now, the dominant narrative is that housing is seen as a market. Housing is seen as a commodity. It is a tool that can be used for profit. It is not necessarily seen as a place that is fundamental for healthy human development. Housing is not currently seen as public safety, as healthcare, as any of the many things that Dr. Buchino just mentioned. And so if we continue to see housing in the way that we do right now, as I just mentioned, I start to feel really hopeless, right? Because if you look at housing as a market, in order for people to be able to profit off of that market, it makes sense, right, for the demand not to meet the supply, because that's how you drive up profits, from what I know, right? And so how are we ever going to see an end to homelessness if there are certain individuals, developers, whoever they may be, who really, really benefit from the way that the system and our culture is set right now? And so that's really the question that keeps me up at night. And what I've started to try to realize and understand in my learning, in my engagement with people who have worked on these issues for decades and decades, is that if we are going to have any possible chance of seeing an end to homelessness in our lifetime, we would really have to take a step back and think about the ways that we view housing. Do we view housing as something that provides safety, stability, and security? Is housing important for us to be able to be engaged in the educational space, in the workspace? If I have stable housing, I have the stability to maybe consider entrepreneurship and how I can contribute to my local economy, and create things that benefit everyone around me if I don't have to worry about where I'm going to lay my head at night. I actually come back from a healthcare background, and I noticed that a lot of our patients in my former job had difficulties benefiting from the many different health programs, preventative health programs that we had to offer, because their priority, the main thing they were thinking about while they were in session with me, was where they're going to lay their head at night. And you cannot engage someone and see positive health outcomes if those priorities and needs are not met. And so the way that I've started to think about housing is that housing is a human right. Housing is an essential element to a healthy society, right? And when you start to think about housing in that way, it would make sense that, well, now we have to look at our budgets and we have to look at our policies, and do our budgets and policies reflect that mentality and belief and that value? I've heard often in this space that, you know, a budget is a value statement. So when you look at our local budget, which is made up of our tax dollars, right? Councilman Arthur talked about the power that we have. You know, I pay taxes, so I want to kind of determine like where are my taxes going to, and I want to make sure my taxes are going to housing, security, and stability for everyone in our community. And is the elected official that represents me at the state, local, and federal level reflecting those values and priorities as well, in the policies that they're supporting or creating? And if that's not the case, I have the power to decide if they're going to get my vote when election time comes back up again. And so I think it's a very large and deep conversation, and it really requires that we take a step back and think about our assumptions and beliefs about housing. And then from there, we can really draw a through line to ensure that our values and beliefs are reflected in our society. So that's how I think that we come to a cultural change. And I know it's a lot to think about, but honestly, otherwise, I think Councilman Arthur is right. We won't see an end to homelessness in our lifetime.
Anybody else want to add on to that?
It's hard to follow Celine with that passion, but I will attempt to do so. Thanks for those words, Celine. And I would just say, I mean, when I talk about housing anywhere, I talk about housing as that keystone issue, like Susan was just contextualizing. It impacts healthcare, transportation, education, health outcomes, economic outcomes. I mean, it is the issue. An investment in housing is an investment in so many other issues that we face as a community. And I would say this, you know, I think about housing as, you know, where do you start your day? Where do you end your day? And how do people answer that question? And I'm hoping it's with a roof over somebody's head, and a roof of where you choose to live, where you have an opportunity to live. And that's a big part of this work for me, this advocacy. You can advocate, you can write op-eds, like Councilman Arthur was saying. There are 26 council members. Engage. You know, learn the issue you want to talk about. If you're having the thoughts on these issues and trying to structure kind of a new way forward on housing and homelessness, other people are having these conversations. So talk to people, build coalitions, build that people power to have those conversations. And just as a historian, that's my background. I've practiced as a historian. I went to school to be a historian. This is all rooted in data. This all has a history to it. We all need to understand that history. We need to understand the development of housing discrimination over time and homelessness over time. And we need to take the data we're continuing to collect and analyze and put that into action. Because it's not just in the history. It's not housing discrimination is not just in our history. It's not just in our presence. And if we don't do anything right now, it's going to continue on into the future. And that's on us. We need to take that action to make that change.
Thanks, Tony. Giselle or Councilman Arthur, do you have anything to add?
No.
I'm going to school today.
Okay, so there was a question that is posted that I really think, Tony, you're one to answer. Could the existing housing stock be made more affordable by increasing the property tax for residential properties owned as income or rental properties? And I don't know if that's like you or Councilman Arthur. One of the things that I hear a lot about is about vacant and abandoned properties too, and how we have so many and then a housing shortage. So are there things that we can do with this, with the existing housing stock?
Yeah, so I ain't got a chart for this, but I wish I did. So out of the few, you know, however many few thousand vacant and abandoned properties that are in this city, it might surprise you that only a couple dozen are actually owned by Louisville Metro. So people often point to those as solutions, but even if we owned all of them and we rehabbed all of them, and we gave all of them away, housing as a human right, we're still talking about 5,000 out of that 31,000. So while it could be a solution for a larger chunk of what we've been able to build in these past few years, it will not be the solution. And I think, you know, we have to look at a multidimensional approach in terms of solutions, but vacant and abandoned properties as of now, unless we totally change at the state level what we're allowed to do with those properties, and in some cases the federal government, what we're allowed to do with those properties that are privately owned by someone who unfortunately is not maintaining it and who doesn't even live in Kentucky. We don't own those properties, so we can't just take them and flip them and convert them and do whatever we want with them to address houselessness.
Yeah, I think Councilman Arthur said what needs to be said there is, I mean, we go back, it's a supply issue too, right? No matter what we do with those limited number of vacant properties, we cannot meet the need that we need in Louisville. Of the 31,412 houses at 30% below, and up to, I think it's 55 or 60,000, up to 80%. So there is much more housing creation that needs to occur. You can look at other policies and programs like Section 8 to home ownership programs that have a long history in Louisville, Louisville being the first, if not one of the first, to have that type of program in Louisville. I mean, it's just a panoply of policies and opportunities that need to be addressed, because this is not a invest $10 million a year and move on issue. It's a much more complex and funding necessary area in which we need to address.
All right, thank you. Let's see. So we've talked about, and I'm going to go back to the poll earlier. There were two questions that were posed. One is, I know who my Metro Council person is and how to contact them. And 76% of our attendants answered yes. And then a second question was, I know that who my state representative is and how to contact them. And again, 76% of those in attendance answered yes. And so, but we've said that that's really important. I know that Tony, as the library host, has put together a one-pager. So not Metropolitan Housing Coalition Tony, Library Tony, who introduced our session today. And Celine and us in partnership have put together some information for you as far as what to do with contacting your representative, how to find out that information. What does a conversation with a representative or a council person look like? What questions should you ask, or what information should you share with your council person that really target this message a little bit more than, hey, I support this, or does just a simple email that says, hey, I support this, I want you to vote for this, does that cut it?
No. Are you talking to Tony still? Is that an open question?
I'm talking to you, to Celine. I know as well, Tony Curtis as an advocate, you all are the ones having these conversations. So what does a strong conversation really look like?
So in my opinion, a strong conversation is more impactful than the quantity and the masses of emails and calls. And let me tell you why. In our office, in addition to passing laws and passing budgets, we have to pass people on to government services, and in some cases, non-government services. So if you are jamming up my email or my phone line with your advocacy calls, which you shouldn't do that to me because I'm your biggest advocate, no disrespect to our other council members, you know, the largest concentration of people who are unhoused are in District 4. Those are my constituents. I'm their biggest advocate. So jamming up my phone doesn't make sense. You got to focus your energy. But let's say you jam up the phone of Councilwoman Amy Holton Stewart, who is also an advocate. If you jam her phone up or you jam up her email, well, now she's going to be missing some of those constituent services that she needs to be addressing through her office. And you create this lag of other services that need to be happening in that flow of work that takes place. I strongly, strongly, strongly encourage you to mobilize people, strategize how you're going to address that council person. And then when you go and you sit down with them, you have to have an organized approach. You got to actually have a conversation. Maybe it's on Zoom right here. Maybe you do a forum or a town hall on the subject, but actually have a conversation, because those emails can be ignored. Those phone calls can be ignored, especially if you are just tapping a button and then the advocacy just shoots. You can call that microwave advocacy. And if it only took you 5 seconds to be an advocate for housing, it could take a council person less than that to ignore you. So keep in mind that what you give is what you get. So it's very important that you don't just leave it at that. And I know there's all sorts of different issues with people having capacity and so forth. But in that scenario, again, that's where the numbers might come in. So I would stay, instead of doing an email campaign, maybe you have a petition. Maybe your neighborhood association signs onto a letter. Maybe you have all the churches in your area sign onto a letter. Maybe you have other council people or state representatives and senators sign onto a letter. There is power in numbers, but you have to concentrate those numbers for it to have the most impact in terms of that power.
Yeah, and I'd like to add too, in my work as a community activist, I've realized, as Councilman Arthur just said, the power in numbers. And I've realized the importance too of the fact that, the elected official in my district, whether that's at the local, state, or federal level, really should be responding to me. But I think it's everything Councilman Arthur said. It's that strategy. I can give an example about the coalition that we built here in Louisville under the leadership of the Coalition for the Homeless. And that coalition brought together a number of nonprofits. It brought together folks at the city level, and we all came together and came to the consensus that we were all concerned about the eviction crisis that had already existed and which is going to get exacerbated because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we decided that, okay, all of us kind of have our own specialties. Maybe this nonprofit does this work, that community organization does this work. How can we use the talents that we have, the skills and resources that we have, and make this fight not as daunting as it might seem if I tried to tackle it and engage a representative on an individual level. And through that coalition work, that made a huge impact and it made a huge difference. And it also allowed us to sustain that work because not any one of us was burnt out about these things. So I think it's critical to educate ourselves about opportunities for realizing a better world. So for example, Tony earlier mentioned some bills that are up in the General Assembly right now, like the eviction expungement bill that Representative Nima Kulkarni filed, HB 159. If you have family that's been impacted by an eviction and they haven't been able to get approved for new housing because they got an eviction filed on their record. And let me just remind everyone that the simple act of filing an eviction immediately gets added to someone's rental history. So it doesn't matter if by the time they went to court, they were able to get rent assistance and that eviction was dismissed. The fact that it was filed at all will be on their record. And so if there's a policy that's in place that could help to remove this significant barrier for housing stability or rehousing, why wouldn't I be talking to every single person that I could? And why wouldn't I be identifying all of my neighbors and my family's council members and my family's state representatives? Do all of those folks know about this bill, and are they in support of it? So if we educate ourselves about what's possible and we build coalitions to help advocate for what's possible, I think a lot more is possible than those one-on-one interactions. I think we need to build relationships with our council persons and our state representatives, considering the fact that they could be your neighbor, they could be your former teacher, they're people just like us. But I think impact comes when we're able to build coalitions and tackle this very difficult work collectively.
Yeah, and I'd like to just tag along onto this. I think one thing we need to say is that after the recent redistricting, make sure you really know who your council person is, just in case it has changed due to redistricting. So go back and double check on that to make sure you're talking to the right person. But coalition building, I think Celine's talking about that is critical to what we do as the Metropolitan Housing Coalition. It's in our name. But the Affordable Housing Trust Fund would not be a reality without a coalition of community members who came together to push for that and continually push for funding for the Affordable Housing Trust Fund. The affordable and fair housing would not have been included in the comprehensive plan 2040. That's the first time affordable and fair housing, the actual words, has actually appeared in a comprehensive plan in Louisville. So that has impacts on rezoning and a lot of different things there. And I would just say this, if you engage, you have a coalition, you go talk to your council person, to your state representative. If you don't get the outcome you want, don't give up. Reform and try to re-engage in a different way. Maybe alter the coalition as well, or add to that coalition. And just thinking about, I live in South Louisville. A man in our neighborhood really wanted the speed bump on our road, and he went around door to door, knocking on doors, asking for people to sign a petition. I'm hoping he has that energy, and others have that same energy on other issues like housing. Take that initiative, be that intentional, do an intentional act such as that, and get involved, because you might find that there are other people who are just as concerned about affordable housing issues, homelessness in the community, and that's how movements grow.
I want to throw one more chart before we get out of here. Now, this chart is relevant for members of Congress, but I truly believe it is a reflection of local government as well. And this chart is about engagement. It's about advocacy. And you can see at the very top, in terms of how much this level of advocacy influenced decision-making, it was in-person issue visits from constituents, contact from constituent reps. Maybe it's your neighborhood association leadership or your board. Maybe it's your pastor at your church. Maybe it's, head of a household, really understanding that a representative of a larger group is important. As I said earlier, masses of emails over the course of time, I don't count that. I try to respond to all of them, but I don't count that. And I don't know that you sent me 1,000 emails to advocate for housing. But if you come to me and meet with me and compel me and convince me with a petition that has 1,000 votes, that's compelling. And you can kind of just look up and down this chart and see what's most impactful at that level of government. But I think this very much so is reflective of Louisville Metro Council as well. And I hope some of my colleagues would agree.
I really appreciate that chart. I think that's really helpful. So there's a question on here that asks, how could someone who has to work 72 hours a week to afford their 1-bedroom rent still have the time in the day to do the kind of policy advocacy work that we're talking about here? And I would also want to say to that, how does the person who has to work 72 hours a day to afford their 1-bedroom rent do the research they need to do to find the resources available to them, or the services that we do offer, or the programs that we do offer, or the luxury, how do they afford the luxury of cell phone minutes or internet that assists them in that? And so I'll toss this to the panelists, but I think that's why those of us who are here today, because we do believe that housing is a right, and that advocacy is something for everyone, and not just the people who need the services, but for people. And Councilman Arthur, you mentioned really early on that it's a moral obligation. If we want a healthy community at large for everyone, if we want a safe community, if we want that compassionate community that we say we are as Louisville, it means that all of us have to contribute to that, and ensure that everyone's concerns are raised, whether there are personal concerns or not. But I'll
Yeah, so you're not gonna like my answer, I think that it's easy to be politically lazy. Earlier, I talked about brushing your teeth. You make time for it because it impacts your physical health. Just like you might make time for something that impacts your social health, your psychological health. Political health is important to practice. And if you, as a person, just truly do not have the time to engage in politics, do you know anybody who can speak on your behalf? And then in that case, you might want to jump in and do some of that microwave advocacy. I'll tell you something to put that into context. I have introduced legislation to protect people who are unhoused, to get historic funding for people who are unhoused, to make sure that relocations are done in a just way, if at all. And I have rarely been engaged by someone who is advocating because they are dealing with that experiences, as in living in a camp. And I go to camps frequently, and I always ask, like, what's going on? Like, what y'all need anything? And folks will often tell me, no, we good. Just tell outreach to come over here and throw me some, So when it comes to understanding how you fit into all of this, if you truly cannot do any advocacy work, okay, but who can? And those people should be doing everything they can, and they should be activated. Earlier, I talked about family and friends. Where are all the people who were protesting last year? I'm pretty sure those folks were at capacity in all sorts of ways. 2 years ago, because we're in a time warp right now known as COVID-19. I'm sure all of those folks were at capacity in a number of ways, but they still hopped in that car. They got that cardboard sign and they painted it, or they put a slogan on it, and they marched in those streets for justice for Breonna Taylor. Rest her soul. You have to build that out. You get the politics you deserve. And I truly believe that politicians do what people allow them to do. Just like right now, I'll say this, then shut up. You got all these candidates going around knocking on doors and doing social media and engaging you for your vote. Have you made them commit to making sure that the Affordable Housing Trust Fund has more than $10 million a year? Because I'm just one vote. Hollander and myself are just 2 votes. We got to get 14 votes to pass something. Have you made your mayoral candidate commit to putting more than 10 million in the budget? Or are you voting for them because you like them? Or because you feel like they're talking the talk? No, you got to get people to commit to something. And if you got the capacity to go out here and vote, you without a doubt should have the capacity to make an informed vote. So hold the candidates accountable as well, in addition to the elected officials, in addition to the people who are your neighbors and fellow voters.
And I'll add too, I always want to bring like that systemic lens to it, right? I think it's really intentional that our systems are created in a way where people lack capacity for that, right? So the only reason that you wouldn't have time to advocate because you're working 70 hours a week is what? Because our minimum wage hasn't changed for over a decade. And so I start to get really angry. Like the more and more I started to dive into politics and policy, I started to realize like, it seems like there's a lot of things going on that are conspiring together to ensure that I can't find the capacity or the motivation or the desire to do any of that stuff. And a lot of that made me really angry. I wanted to be engaged. I wanted to do a lot of different things, but when you get home from even just a 40-hour work week, and I don't even have any kids, like, I still had a lot of trouble finding the will and motivation to do those things. And so I think that the education is really lacking oftentimes in how our politics work and the impact of policies. Like a lot of the education I've attained started out in the streets. It started out in 2020, where my anger brought me there. And then I started to hear from other folks who have been doing this work and started to make connections and, like understand a lot of how these systems work. And when I had access to that education and access to see what other people were doing, I was able to learn from like, okay, well, this person doesn't really go out and march, but every time there's a campaign on social media, they make sure that they call their representatives. They look at the scripts that organizations are able to offer. So there's people who do the advocacy work all day, every day. But are you tapped into those organizations where you can find what your lane is? If your lane is maybe volunteering once a month with the Coalition for the Homeless, whatever it is that you can contribute, please do contribute that. But I think it's interesting that if we were able to really educate a lot more people on how we are literally held back. I mean, we're talking about voting rights policies at the federal level, and imagine just how like all of those policies related to voting are intentionally made so it makes it difficult for us to engage. So I think we need a lot of community education about how all these systems work, and then from there taking our personal responsibility to figure out, well, within what I can do, let me make sure that I'm doing that, no matter what that looks like.
And I lied. I'm gonna say one more thing. Do you think that people who were enslaved in this country had the capacity to fight for emancipation? Do you think that the Jim Crow, Jane Crow, Jim Crow Jr. Black folk throughout the South had the capacity to fight to abolish Jim Crow? Absolutely not. They did not. They had everything going against them, complete hopelessness. But somehow, some way, they found a sliver of hope and used that to fight and abolish slavery and abolish segregation. And they're still operating and moving and organizing today. If they can do it, we can do it. My 5 times great-grandfather was a slave. And this man wrote the book on the AME Church and founded the first Black school in the western part of the country. The AME Church that Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth went to. Do you really think that they had capacity to fight for emancipation? Absolutely not. But they had the will. So therefore they ended up doing it. And I'll also say this, and then I will actually shut up. As a musician, I'm gonna throw this analogy out there. When it comes to politics, when it comes to advocacy, everyone, and Celine said this, everyone has some sort of role to play. But unfortunately, we think we're all supposed to do the same thing. When I go see your Louisville orchestra, I cannot imagine that all 50 or 60 musicians would be sitting on that stage playing crash cymbals. No, you have a brass section. Somebody's playing tuba and trombone and French horn and trumpet. You got the strings, the violins, the viola, the cello, the double bass. You got a woodwind section. You got the percussion section. You have the conductor, Maestro Teddy Abrams. Everyone has a part to play to contribute to that symphony. You have to ask yourself, what is your part? But to say that you don't have the capacity to play any part, and then on the back end complain about what you did or did not get, that is being politically lazy. The president at the HBCU I teach at says there's 3 types of people in this world. 1, people who make things happen, which I challenge us all to be. 2, people who watch things happen. And 3, people who ask what happened. And I guarantee you that whenever we allocate all of this American Rescue Plan money, you're going to have a swath of people across this city saying, what happened? Where did all of that money go? How come you didn't listen to us? How come we didn't get to contribute and add our opinion to that? Well, you just saw the chart. People added their opinions. And based on that community support, we allocated more money for affordable housing than we have in the past 7 years combined because of that American Rescue Plan and because of your advocacy.
Speaking of that budget, Councilman Hollander has also joined us today. So I've added his capacity to unmute, and he had something to add too. Councilman Hollander, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, so Jecorey actually just said what I was going to say, which is I think in general, elected officials do the best job they can at listening to people. But I guarantee you that when you're a candidate and you knock on a door and somebody tells you that housing is the most important thing that can be funded in the city, they'll remember that. Or if you see a mayoral candidate out on the street, or if you attend a forum, you will never have a better opportunity to get the attention of who's going to represent you at City Hall, both in the mayor's office and in council, than in the elections in the next few months. So make your voice heard to candidates, not just elected officials.
All right, well, we're at 4:03. Thank you again for being here, and to our panelists. Tony, did you want to wrap up on behalf of the library?
Sure. Thank you so much for everyone. That's a lot of great information. I put a few things in the chat here and there. I included a link to some books for young people and children that discuss it thematically or have some connection with homelessness, because I feel like being the library, naturally, we have lots of materials, books as well, but it's important to think about the next generation. As Councilman Arthur said, this is likely not going to end here And so it's important that we move forward. So I encourage you, if you look at that list and you have young people in your life or children, there's some really great books on that as well. But again, thank you to everyone who's been here, and all of the organizations that were helpful in putting this together. Have a wonderful day. There will be a survey at the end when you disconnect. So please, if you would, that helps us in our future programming and making events. Have a wonderful day. Thank you so much.